First of all, just let me introduce myself. I'm Barrie Stephenson. I have a small business called Digistories, and what I do is help people tell their stories digitally and help facilitators to tell their stories as well. I encountered digital storytelling at the BBC, and a question I was often asked at the BBC is, well, what is digital storytelling? And it may be that despite listening to the two speakers this morning, the three speakers this morning, you might still be saying, well, what is digital storytelling? How is it defined? Is it a form, a genre? What is it? So in the next 20 minutes, I hope to help you understand what digital storytelling is. I was running one of the BBC's local radio stations, the one in York, and in 2001 somebody showed me a digital story, and another digital story, and another digital story. They were a crew from BBC Wales, from what became the Capture Wales project, and I was absolutely intrigued with what I saw. A few months later, the BBC advertised for an executive producer to run digital storytelling in BBC English regions. So I parked myself at the front of the queue, and I was very grateful when someone who had been my boss in the past rang me up and said, Barrie, you've got the job. And before long I had a budget, had a team of people, and we were all sitting around asking ourselves, so what is digital storytelling? How do we do it? Thankfully, we had a great guru called Daniel Meadows, who was the mover behind the Capture Wales project at BBC Wales, and he and his team took our team and trained us in how to make digital stories. And we had to make our own digital story. And since then, I've insisted that anyone who wants to run digital storytelling workshops has to make their own digital story. There's no other way you understand digital storytelling properly without making one for yourself. So don't think you know if you've not made one. And I can only tell you a limited amount of what it is, because I haven't got time for you to make one today. But you do need to make one to fully understand what digital storytelling is about. The other great thing I had in the BBC, of course, was airtime. They were going to let these stories made by ordinary people with no previous media skills to be shown on the television. And it was before we had hundreds of digital channels to choose from, so it had to be BBC One or BBC Two. And so we had 80 films on BBC One and BBC Two over the period of the project. And I thought, here we have stories made by real people being shown to millions. Now this is one that was made during that time. We were gathering stories about World War II for the People's War series. And this one was made in Leeds, and it mentions museums, so I thought it would be appropriate in this context. It just happens to be one of my favourite digital stories from the Telling Lives era, which was the name of the BBC project I was running.
Please. In 1942 I was only 11, but like everybody else I had to do my bit for the war effort. So I became a bellboy on the trams in Leeds. It was a time of total blackout. If the wardens spotted the slightest chink of light through your curtains, they'd be round shouting, "Put that blooming light out!" There were no street lights, so getting around even on the trams wasn't easy. It was so dark the passengers couldn't tell where they were. So my job was to stand on the back platform, shout out the stops and ring the bell for the driver to stop and start. Granville Street, pass down the car please. I loved it. I was tram mad as a kid. I'd learned the word tam-tam before I could say dada, and I knew I was grown up when I could reach the hand straps. Being a bellboy was something you had to work up to. You had to get well in with the conductress, so on the way home from school I'd say, "Can I ring the bell, miss? Can I ring the bell?" And if she liked you, she'd let you. So I'd rush home, bolt my tea, and be back on the same tram as it came back down. And I'd work up until about 8 o'clock at night when I'd have to go home to bed. I remember one summer going past the front of Quarry Hill Flats, and the sloping grass bank, instead of being green, was blue, with hundreds of wounded soldiers back from Dunkirk in their hospital blue uniforms. And in those days of the war, you did see a lot of men with injuries and missing limbs, and they were allowed to travel free on the trams. It was our acknowledgement of the sacrifice they'd made. At the grand age of 14, I was forced into early retirement due to parental pressure and homework. And with the war coming to an end, the lights coming on all over Britain, the demand for bellboys was in decline. But now, 60 years later, I just happen to be a qualified tram driver on those same trams from the war, now preserved in the National Museum. Ready, Bank, Junction, Gas House, hurry along please.
So, when I and others watched these stories that were being made in workshops by ordinary people, we heard lots of comments from people. Of course, the professionals weren't very fond of them. I remember one professional looking at some of the stories we made, and he said, "And how long did it take them to learn how to do this?" And I said, "About 5 days." He said, "I spent 5 years learning how to make television. And this is more interesting than the stuff I'm churning out." You probably saw some of the stuff he was churning out because he worked at the BBC here in Newcastle. People were saying that these stories were more intimate, more honest, more authentic, more interesting, more engaging than the things that we were normally producing. In many of our worlds, yours and mine, I suppose, that I was a journalist and news broadcaster essentially, and a lot of you are involved in an industry where we have to be factually accurate. Facts are the order of the day, and we like information, we like things to be well presented. But for most people, what they want is warmth, emotional attachment, and empathy. Not at the expense of facts, but as well as them. And I think digital stories actually give us a lot of heart as well. And often it's easy to engage heads, but engaging hearts is what makes the difference. And we've already heard it said today that there's the emotional content of these stories, and it's extremely valuable both for the people telling the story and, perhaps more importantly for me as a broadcaster, for the people watching and listening to the stories. And I think that's why digital stories made that leap of being more intimate, more engaging, because when you're involved with it, you feel, I'm part of this. I identify with what's being said. It's not some impartial voice that is just telling me what I need to know. It's engaging me and who I am. So, how do we get there? Well, before I tell you how we get there, the BBC finished the project called Telling Lives after 2.5 years. We gained an awful lot of experience, but they felt it was going to have to live on its own merits after that. And although my heart said no, 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 my head said it makes sense. And so I left the BBC and started Digistories, and there's some people that I've trained. Somewhere in the middle of there are some culture shock people who went through some of my workshops at the beginning of their project. And we had great fun doing it as well. And so I took on this whole new area of trying to make money out of digital storytelling, whereas before I'd taken money rather than making money, because that's the way the BBC works. It takes all your money in hopes it delivers something back that you all find valuable as the public. And right at the start, of course, I thought, well, I better make a story that people can use so that they can get an idea of how digital stories work. So I want to show you a story that if you've been involved in any of my workshops, you will be bored up to here with it. You'll have seen it so many times. And yet, There's something about seeing a digital story over and over again that they still live and they still have value and they're vibrant. So I'm not going to apologise for showing this one again. I've shown this picture to dozens of people. What do you think it's about? I ask them. Some say it's about a father going away, or perhaps coming back from war. Or maybe it's a picture of children caught between divorced or separated parents. I use the picture to explain that there are stories that no one else can tell. Only the people in the picture really know what's happening. So that's me, on the left, next to my sister Ruth. And the man in the middle is Emrys. He was a young Welshman coming to the end of his national service in the RAF. My dad is taking the picture, and my mum, that's her on the right, is giving him the sort of look that says, "If you take it from there, dear, I'll be in the shot, and I don't want to be." So the picture should have looked like this. Now that my mum's out of the way, I'll tell you what this picture says to me. It says, trousers. Look at them. I hated those trousers. Mum made them from cheap worsted material bought from the market. They made me itch. And look at the shape of them. They didn't fit. The waistband was wrong. And no matter how many pairs she made, they looked out of shape and ill-fitting. Don't misunderstand me, I love my mum. Her name was Alice, and she loved me. We weren't rich, and she was doing her best to dress me. I was taunted by those trousers, though. I felt kids pointing and giggling when I walked into school. I may have been deeply affected for life. You judge. So tell me, why did I allow my boys to be dressed in trousers made by their mother? I can hear them now, almost in unison. I hated those trousers. I have to say that film's not very fair on my wife. And she doesn't like it. Because she is actually quite a good seamstress. And the trousers that my boys had were made far better than the ones that I had to wear. But you see, it's that surprise in the digital story. It's not the big picture, it's the small picture. The story of the rich and famous will always be told, but the story of the poor and the losers, if you like, in any situation, is more difficult to extract. But digital storytelling allows people to tell their story, whoever they are. And I've never found anyone yet who hasn't been able to tell their story. So, what is a digital story? Well, let me tell you the basic ingredients of a digital story. A digital story consists of a personal narrative. It's not somebody else telling the story, it's the storyteller telling the story. That's how you get the authentic bit. It's their story. I always often say to people when they say, well, I need to find out more about this and more about that. And I say, no, you're the expert in your story. You know what you felt, you know where you were, you know why you were there, you know all those things, you've carried them around, they're your story, they've shaped your life. Not as you might discover if you research it, but as it really has happened to you. And we all live with those stories, don't we? We meet people who say, oh, I'd never do that because once something happened. That's how their story has affected their behaviour. So, a short narrative, a personal narrative, 200 to 300 words. I was having a little joke with Alex earlier on saying, I've got this into 20 minutes. How do you get a lifetime into 20 minutes? 2 to 3 minutes, you told us, Barry, when you trained us. And it's right, you can get a whole lot into 2 to 3 minutes. And a lot of people come with great tomes of life stories. And it's a matter of just picking out that one event that sums up a little bit of who they are. You're never going to tell your whole story. I mean, if you watch my film, I don't know what you would make of me. You know, am I a man in his 60s, still upset about the shape of his trousers? I don't think so. But that's what that picture meant to me. 12 to 20 pictures out of the personal albums of the people who are telling the story. People often say, oh, can't I just go on the internet and get some pictures off Google? Well, no, because there are all sorts of rights issues with that. Your own family pictures, there are no rights issues with them. You can use them, and nobody else has seen them. They're all fresh, they're new, they might be a little bit out of focus, a bit wonky. It doesn't matter. They're personal pictures. They mean something to you, and that means that as you tell the story, they'll mean something to other people. So how do we help them to create stories like this? I think one of the big keys is that we give them ownership. We let them tell their own story. We give them the skills they need to be able to tell it. And that's why I think digital stories need to be made in a workshop. It's possible to make them outside the workshop, but the workshop experience is just such a bigger experience than sitting on your own and trying to concoct a script and decide on what are the best bits of your story. Because if you can tell your story in a story circle, and other people go, oh, I never knew that, or that's interesting, tell me more, you know that your story is on the right track. And the response of those people helps you to fashion and shape your story so that it's interesting. I can remember when I did my story circle, I said to some of my colleagues, I said, I wished I'd learned this when I first became a journalist. Because when you're a journalist, you're in your own little box, you write the story, you give it to the editor, and what comes out in the paper or on the air will depend on whether somebody judged whether that story was any good or not. And that's pretty well how it works. And any feedback you get is possibly trivial, maybe that story didn't work, sorry we didn't publish it. You may not get any feedback at all, whereas in the story circle you get lots of feedback and people are encouraging and it works really well. And that allows people to feel good about their story. And once you've discovered the story, I've found that nothing will stop them from learning the skills to make sure it's told. And you sit people in front of a computer and say, I'm going to teach you how to use a computer, and they say, oh, I'm frightened, I don't know what to do, and they're nervous. Find their story first and sit them in front of a computer. And they're eager to know how to do it, how to put things together, the pictures and the sound, and they're fascinated with the whole process as it comes to life in their hands. And they start to see it on the screen, and they realise at the end of it they're going to have something that they can show other people and be really proud of. That's what makes digital storytelling so precious, I think. I'm going to show you a story now from the Northeast. I'm in the Northeast. For those of you from Newcastle and you think this is a funny accent, he's from Durham. Right, Mr. Peace Out, I'm dreadfully sorry. Okay, these are the skills we teach people. Very quickly go through this. First of all, the skill to find a story, to script or signpost it, depending on the skills of the individual, how to use their voice, how to find and process their images, how to assemble their story assets, and how to put those together as a piece of film or video to output in some way. And then, finally, the most important part of telling a story is that you show it. If you're thinking of running a digital storytelling project, can I please say, look at what Culture Shock have done, because they thought about what was going to happen to these stories once they were made. I get involved in so many projects where they only think about how we're going to get the stories in. And then when it comes to putting them out, they've run out of funds. They didn't budget it in. And showing these stories is what we're doing it for. Not to hide them away in a drawer, on a hard drive, on a CD, or whatever, but for them to be seen by the public, by anybody who wants to see them. So here's the guy from Durham. We were telling stories about the mayor of Durham and the mayor's bodyguard, and this is why Brian told this story.
It's 4 o'clock on a bitterly cold, wet January morning. I'm sheltering in a doorway, trying to convince myself that I've not yet frozen to death, and I'm waiting to meet my shift inspector, Harry Crowe. He discovers my sanctuary, and his first endearing words are something like, Who was the first Bishop of Durham? Or, where was the perfume garden? He, of course, being a walking reference book, knew the answers to all his historical questions. My name is Brian Petrie. I joined the police cadets straight from school and began my life in uniform, which was dominated by discipline and regimentation. I became a constable at 19. I've worked in many aspects of police work, but I'll always be grateful to Inspector Crowe for instilling so much knowledge of the city of Durham. When I was given the opportunity to join the Mayor's Bodyguard in 1992, I had to decide if I was willing, in public, to make an exhibition of myself. I made the decision and joined, and it's been an honour to represent the city of Durham in the presentation of parts of its rich history and pageantry. The history of the Bodyguard actually predates the first Mayor of Durham by some 300 years. I was appointed captain of the Bodyguard in 1998, sword bearer, and then sergeant at mace in 2003. The sword and mace are historically the personal bodyguards to the Right Worshipful, the Mayor. The highlights of my mayoral service have been many and varied, including many visits to the city's adopted warship, the aircraft carrier HMS Invincible, and the visit of Her Majesty the Queen in 2002. The Queen's visit was witnessed by my good friend Herb Ray from Tucson, Arizona. I can safely say he was impressed. Many times while on parade, my mind goes back to that cold shop doorway on North Road in Durham, where this story began.
So just let me finish with some, going back to the BBC. Greg Dyke was Director General, and he said to me in a conversation, "I watch hundreds of hours of television in the course of my job, and most of it's soon forgotten. So tell me, Barry, why can I still remember the first digital story I ever watched?" That story was made by Capture Wales. It's called Scratching the Surface by Debbie Rideout. And if you put that into Scratching the Surface, Debbie Rideout into Google, you can still watch that story. Compelling little story made in 2 minutes. So really, what is digital storytelling? In 20 minutes, that's as much as I can get in. I could talk to you all day, but then I'd be very unpopular. So I'll close it there. Thank you very much.